Hello and welcome again to Why Fight, a conference on politics and ideology in militaries and armed groups, organized by the UCD Centre for War Studies. Our papers in this session will examine how ideologies as sets of vaguely but not necessarily consistent ideas have influenced the behavior of soldiers, officers, and military planners. Our next speaker is Dr. Ákos Bartha of the Institute of History of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. Ákos will examine the theory and praxis of total racialism as a factor in the activities of Hungarian paramilitaries. Although total racialism was developed as a highly anti-Semitic, far-right ideology in Miklos Horthy's Hungary, towards the end of the Second World War, some Hungarian state-sponsored paramilitaries ended up fighting against their German allies. How could this happen? Over to Ákos for the answer.
Hello, I'm Ákos Bartha, and I will talk about a special Hungarian topic, the theory and praxis of total racialism. Just first of all, I just aim to draw a very short overview on the born of the modern Hungary. In sum, after defeated in World War I, a democratic revolution and the communist coup followed each other in the newly independent state. The stormy years marked by the Red and the White Terror had been ended by the long-lasting counter-revolutionary regime led by Miklos Horthy, who became the regent of the country in March 1920. 3 months later, the Treaty of Trianon codified that the country lost 2/3 of her historical territory. Thus, irredentism became the most important political topic in the whole era. The new white regime used the key phrase of racialism, which is an important ideological framework of the interwar Hungary. Hungarian racialists were hardliner revisionists who wanted to re-annex all the territories which had been lost. During the 30s, many of the racialist leaders found their places in the new Hungarian fascist or national socialist parties, but not all of them. Many racialist politicians and writers refused the new far right. You can see on the screen a very short bio on one of them, Dr. Yiannis, who was a leader of this intellectual group. Hungarian racialists propagated a kind of total racialism aimed against outlander ideologies like Bolshevism and Nazism, but also against ethnic groups like Jewry and later Germans in Hungary. Their authentic Hungarian worldview was based on geopolitics and penetrated by an anxiety from expansions of the Soviet Union and also the Third Reich. They considered racialism as a defensive ideology of the Hungarian nation, which is threatened by the surrounding small states like Romania, Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia, and also by big powers. Thus, Hungarian total racialism was a kind of anti-imperialism, even this imperialism was real or just imagined. The main contradiction concerning this approach and the reality was that anti-Nazi racialists, like most of the Hungarians, welcomed the returned territories in the end of the 30s and in the beginning of the 40s, although this goal was achieved thanks to the support of the Nazi Germany. A very brief ideological comparison of fascism and racialism seems to be important here. Everything before, racialism has to distinguish from racism, which is always based on strict biologism. The simplest example is Nazism, of course, with the central role of blood. Let's think about the Blut-und-Boden theory. By contrast, Hungarian racialists, in other words, race defenders, consider race mostly as a product of history and culture, albeit they use biological metaphors and their terminology was not always consistent. Secondly, with the words of Roger Griffin and Konstantin Jordahy, fascists wanted to realize the utopia of the total new order, while non-fascist radicals hesitated to do so. Partly that was the reason why followers of total racialism refused not only communists, but also the Nazi totalitarianism. From the end of the 30s, by the time of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, total racialism started to become well organized in Hungary. Without aiming to give a full list, the following organizations are the most important in Hungary. Hungarian Fraternal Community, National Association of the Hungarian Racialists, Rugged Guard, True-Born Hungarians, National Association of Turan Hunters, National Side, Association of National Defense, and Combatant Association. Sooner or later, these parties and organizations turned against the Nazi Germany. Some of them became anti-Nazi only during the last part of the war, after the Voronezh defeat of the Hungarian army in the beginning of 1943, while others were established originally as rivals of the German loyal Arrow Cross Party, or ACP. I will use this acronym here. One of the most important key players of official support they enjoyed was Count Pál Teleki, who was Prime Minister of Hungary 2 times, secondly between February 1939 and April 1941. Teleki encouraged rightist anti-Nazi organizations, parties, and campaigns as competition for the sergeant pro-Nazi formations in Hungary. He tried to find an alternative for the imbalanced Hungarian foreign policy based on loyalty to Germany, but it was by no means easy to retain Berlin's support for the regaining of territories on one hand, while staying out of the war on the other. Finally, under the pressure of the Yugoslav crisis in April 1941, Teleki committed suicide. The most effective, long-lasting paramilitary organization, the Rugged Guard, was established originally in the beginning of the Horthy era. They participated in anti-Semitic pogroms and fought against Austrian forces in Burgenland in 1921, enjoying an implicit support of the Hungarian government. By the time of the political consolidation in the 20s, many Rugged were incorporated in regular armed force like gendarmerie, police, or army. Later, in the middle 30s, some of them became special agents of the 5th Department of the Homeland Defense Force General Staff. Rugged Guard was reactivated in 1938 when Hitler dismembered the multi-ethnic state of Czechoslovakia, where more than 1 million Hungarians lived. Hungarian paramilitary corps infiltrated into southern Czechoslovakia and Ruthenia as guerrillas just before the First Vienna War. They were saboteurs who tried to prepare the Hungarian territorial revision aims. During these subversive actions, they damaged the local infrastructure, fought both with the Czechoslovak forces and the Ukrainian siege guards, furthermore probably insulted and killed inhabitants, mostly Jews. Rugged Guardsmen's anti-German attitude was proved already in 1921 when they were fighting for Burgenland. Tough, fears from the big neighbor were easily could revive after the Anschluss in 1938. Many Guardsmen despised not only Slovaks, Romans, and Jews, but also the Germans. Therefore, they had serious conflicts with the German minority organizations of the region. From the end of the 30s, they acted against Volksbund, the newly established Völkisch Association of the Germans in Hungary. However, irregular corps used in the uplands actions were very heterogeneous from an ideological political point of view. As disparate and fanatic nationalists, all of them wanted to fight for the historical border of Hungary, but not in the same way. There were huge numbers of Nazi sympathizers, followers of Arrow Cross Party, among them the ACP. It came from the fact that 1938 and 1939 was the high time of ACP, when the radicals became the dominant oppositionist formation in the Hungarian parliament. Arrow Cross sympathizers, the so-called Hungarists in other words, and other pro-Nazi formations in Hungary considered sabotage actions abroad as an opportunity to demonstrate their power. Therefore, some Arrow Cross-dominated units were disarmed by the Hungarian government, and the loudest troublemakers were sent back to Budapest. Albeit Free Corps played only a minor role by the decision of the First Vienna War, rivalry immediately began between the pro-German and the anti-German veterans for the glory. For example, a conflict was emerged around József Rozs, an experienced volunteer who had died in the Battle of Munkács at the beginning of 1939. Rozs received a military funeral assisted by the National Association of the Hungarian Racialists. Anti-German periodicals discussed his bravery with a horrific photo taken from the headshot youngster. At the same time, Arrow Cross leaders commemorated him as a Hungarist, and probably that was true. Rozs had been accused in a legal process initiated against the Hungarian National Socialists just a few months before his death. Finally, Rozs received the highest possible military honor, the Hungarian Gold Medal of Bravery from Regent Horthy. Now let's jump a few years to the time when the war reached Hungary in the end of August 1944. The newly appointed Prime Minister, General Géza Lakatos, established Home Guard, a militia officially aimed to secure the hinterland for the fighting corps, preventing sabotage and partisan actions. But in reality, Home Guard was organized for preparing for the changeover of the German-occupied Hungary. Nevertheless, Horthy attempts to leave the war and the German alliance was unsuccessful, and the Germans led Ákos Bartha to take power in the middle of October 1944. Hungary's reorganized Home Guard and auxiliary security forces with Hungarian acronym KISKA. Having not enough armed and trained soldiers, Hungary just simply took over the Home Guard and renamed it in the beginning of November. Many KISKA commanders or soldiers were coming from racialist organizations. That was the case with Kálmán Zsapka, who was a well-known right radical troublemaker of the contemporary Hungarian public life. For example, Zsapka was the main organizer of an unsuccessful attempt for helping Poland just before the German invasion. In the beginning of July 1939, he led some volunteers through the newly created Polish-Hungarian border after a discussion with Jan Emiszarski, the Polish military attaché in Budapest. This group infiltrated to Slavsko and tried to relocate more than 100 guardsmen from Hungary to Gdansk, cooperating with Polish officers. But this conspiracy was leaked out, and the ACP made a huge international scandal from it. In 1944, Zsapka commanded one of the biggest KISKA in Budapest, which took part in the Hungarian armed resistance. As an experienced paramilitary commander, he had an efficient corps with approximately 1,000 soldiers in District Zugló. It's located in Budapest. It's important to underline that most of these soldiers or deserters just wanted to survive, not to fight to anyone. However, it doesn't apply for Right Guard members who followed their leader to here. Zsapka formed special squads from this hardline and experienced anti-German soldiers. They were fighting in the night against ACP militiamen and surprisingly rescued many Jews. Probably they did it not only for humanitarian reasons, but for thinking about their future as well, just before the total collapse. Thus, albeit the official aim of KISKA was to secure the hinterland for the Hungarian and German army, it became very soon a covert organization for Jews, leftists, deserters, and resistance fighters. It's much more difficult to explain their relations to the German troops. A main conspirator of KISKA, Captain Zoltán Mikó, brought over to his side some disappointed Volksdeutsch Hungarian-born SS who were recruited by one of the largest transnational armies of that time, the Waffen-SS, quoting here the words of Robert Gerwart and Robert Gilda. Another connecting point was illegal business. For instance, Zsapka bought a very precious SS Jagdverband certification that they cannot be moved from the front line. Sometimes KISKA leaders corrupted German officers for uniforms or weapons. Thus, it hardly can be clarified that real German SS soldiers or Hungarian soldiers in German uniform rescued Jews in several cases. In sum, we know 17 KISKA corps in Budapest connected to the Hungarian underground. Among them, there were many commanders, deputy commanders or members who had associated with Right Guard or other racialist organizations. Practical or career aspects were also important, of course. For example, a young tradesman who later made his luck in West Germany as József von Ferenczy joined Right Guard and Turul Association in the 30s. By the time of the Aryanization of the Jewish property, Ferenczy became a successful tradesman and film producer in Budapest. That was his main link to the resistance, since the movie makers had an own illegal platform here, Żabka was a film producer and actor as well. Radical rightists can be found among the second in command of KISKA as well. The KISKA battalion, based in the traditional worker district of Budapest, called Angyalföld, was the biggest and the most effective auxiliary force in Budapest. One of its commanders from the fore, Imre Kapocsfi, was a Turan hunter who was linked to the Hungarian National Uprising Liberation Committee, the main organization of the Hungarian resistance. Ferenc Kálmánfi, another company commander of this KISKA, was a former ECP member who later served in an anti-partisan squad in the Eastern Front. He was honored with the Knight Cross of the Hungarian Order of Merit for his services. The third company commander, Tivadar Horváth, served in the Guard and was decorated with National Defense Cross. Despite, or partly because, their past, both of them participated in the armed resistance in the end of the war. And now we come to the conclusions now, trying to answer our main question, why fight? In the case of the Guard, the answer is quite simple. They fought for territories which has been lost for Hungary in the Trianon Treaty. Hungarian racialists originally considered Jewry and the surrounding nations as the main danger for the Hungarian nation. Later, this concept was completed with two big powers, the Soviet Union and the Third Reich. The key word here is anxiety, since racialists felt themselves in the front line of their arch enemies. Therefore, during World War II, they have been faced with the problem of the ranking. Which power seems to be the most serious threats for the Hungarian nation? Thirdly, in the end of 1944, that was quite clear that Germany lost the war and the totally new era is coming. Racialists needed to collect good points to avoid serious reckonings. And finally, some of them were motivated for humanitarian reasons as well in the time of mass murders and genocide. Thank you very much for your attention.